Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, ready to bring to you all another dose of gaming history. A topic that is fast becoming a popular fixture on this channel is wrestling games, which makes a lot of sense considering my vast array of experience as an independent wrestler mixed with my penchant for creating fighting game and beat 'em up content. Wrestling videos just seems to be a natural part of this channel's evolution. As part of this new wave of videos, we began to look at the WWF Arcade Games, starting off with the first one ever made, WWF Superstars, a Japanese game from Technos that came from the creators of Double Dragon, which can easily be identified in both the gameplay and art style found in this classic game. Next we looked at WWF WrestleFest, Technos' sequel to Superstars, and a game many people consider their favourite wrestling game right up until this very day. Thus far, the WWF in the world of arcade gaming had a spotless track record of quality, but what about the next to carry the WWF brand? As you can see from looking at the gameplay, this one is vastly different to the games that came before it. So, in today's video, we are going to be looking at what led to these major changes, how this game handles, and how on earth we ended up receiving a game that looks more like Mortal Kombat than a traditional wrestling game. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of WWF Wrestlemania, the arcade game, the Mortal Kombat wrestling game. Yeah! The year is 1995. It is a strange time for wrestling as the WWF are moving further and further away from their great time of prosperity. It has now been 8 years since Hulk Hogan slammed Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, and moments such as the Mega Powers exploding are fading further and further into the past. The company had recently had its reputation tarnished due to a huge steroid scandal, and none of the company's biggest established names were with the company any longer. Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage were now with rival company WCW, and the Ultimate Warrior had left the company due to various civil disputes, and Andre the Giant had sadly passed away due to congestive heart failure in 1993. To excuse the pun, the superstars they had built who featured in WWF Superstars were no longer a part of the brand. Pair all of this with the recent steroid scandal, and the company would choose to shift their television focus towards trying to create new marquee names in a time period in wrestling which is often remembered as the new generation era today. The WWF product was vastly different to yesteryear, with focus slightly shifted away from muscle-bound meatheads and over to technical wrestling and athleticism, leading to smaller athletes such as Bret Hart and the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels fighting amongst the top of the card for the first time. It was not just wrestling that had changed drastically since the release of the Technos WWF games though, arcade gaming itself had changed a lot in that time frame too. The very same year WWF WrestleFest saw release Street Fighter II would be introduced to the world as well. The versus fighting game that would be the most popular arcade game of its era that would spawn countless imitations influencing future fighting games within the genre right up until today. In terms of successful games that were influenced by Street Fighter II shortly after the game's release, we of course have Mortal Kombat, a game that featured the basic Street Fighter II formula of play but introduced a whole host of attractive features that would make the game stand out on its own 2 feet. Mortal Kombat was different to everything that came before it, and the American game, developed and published by Midway, quickly became very famous and sparked much controversy for its depiction of extreme violence and gore using realistic looking digitized graphics. There was nothing like Mortal Kombat at the time, and the game's use of deadly finishing moves, known as fatalities, quickly made the game the talk of the world. It was not long before Midway were applying this digitized graphical style to create games from other genres such as sports. 1993 would see the arrival of NBA Jam, a game that found popularity instantly due to its photorealistic digitized graphics, over-the-top presentation and exaggerated style of 2-on-2 basketball play. The new generation of 2D graphics were here. After Midway released some entertaining fighting games and entertaining sports games of this ilk, it would not be long until they gained the licensing rights to create their first sports entertainment game, which, as we all know, is of course WWF Wrestlemania the arcade game. According to one of the programmers who worked on this project, known as Mark Turmel, he stated that he worked on this game for 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 6 months straight, and that people would play the game all day in his office, giving feedback on how to improve it. Development was painstakingly difficult in order to get this game right for its scheduled date of release. The game is notably very different to many wrestling games to which came both before it and after it, which in part I would guess is due to the small window in which games featuring digitised graphics were hugely popular, but at the same time there is so much more than that. In fact, apart from looking vastly different to most other wrestling games, it also plays very differently too, handling much more like a fast-paced fighting game than the majority of titles built around the field of sports entertainment, which we will discuss more about shortly after we look at the colourful lineup of wrestlers this game contains. One player mode in this game gives consumers a choice of 8 different characters to choose from. Amongst this lot we of course have Bret Hart, the wrestler who was pretty much positioned as the main blue eye at the beginning of the New Generation era. Just in case you didn't instantly infer what blue eye means, it is British wrestling kayfabe for babyface. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, the kayfabe terminology you hear on most YouTube channels is American English kayfabe, not proper English kayfabe, but true kayfabe. Anyway, this Canadian from Calgary and the famous Hart wrestling family have broken away from the Hart Foundation and tag team wrestling, capturing the WWF Heavyweight Championship on 5 different occasions throughout the 90s. We then have Shawn Michaels, a man who would go on to be the Hitman's greatest rival. At the time of this game's release, he was yet to capture the championship, but he did win the Royal Rumble match in 1995 and competed for the WWF title in a losing effort to his former bodyguard Diesel at WrestleMania of that year. Further from this we have Lex Luger, a muscle-bound wrestler who at one point WWF would try to position as the next Hulk Hogan. According to Bruce Pritchard, his push to the top was curtailed due to it not working properly, nor was he drawing a big enough audience. By 1995 he had formed a tag team with the British Bulldog, known as the Allied Powers, a patriotic celebration of the athletes' countries, winning a number of wars alongside each other. Next up we have The Undertaker, a man who would go on to become one of the most legendary wrestlers of all time. By 1995 he had already begun to carve out a legacy for himself with an early WWF Championship win against Hulk Hogan himself in 1991 and winning every WrestleMania match up until this point. The streak continued with a victory over the returning King Kong Bundy at that year's Showcase of the Immortals. Players can also choose to play as Bam Bigelow, recognisable by his close to 400-pound frame and the distinctive flame tattoo that spanned most of his bald head. In an attempt to generate some outside interest for the promotion, Bam would headline WrestleMania that year against New York Giants All-Pro linebacker Lawrence Taylor in an ambitious crossover no one wanted nor asked for. The game features the bad guy Razor Ramon, who was a shady and stylish Cuban-American bully from Miami, modelled on Scarface's Tony Montana. In 1995 he became the first man in history to hold the Intercontinental Championship, a record-breaking 3 times. He competed in a matchup for that very title that year at WrestleMania against Jeff Jarrett. Yokozuna was also included in this game's roster, a 2-time WWF Heavyweight Champion with wins over Bret Hart and even Hulk Hogan himself. By WrestleMania of 1995, Yokozuna now weighed an incredible 650 pounds and would appear as Owen Hart's surprise tag team partner to defeat the Smoking Guns for the tag gold. The final roster member and the most unlikely inclusion to the lineup in my opinion was Doink the Clown, the character who initially played cruel jokes on both fans and wrestlers in order to amuse himself, who was originally played by a gentleman named Matt Bourne, who would be fired for reoccurring drug abuses. After the role bounced from person to person, it eventually led to Ray Liccamelli, predominantly playing Doink on TV, who was made more popular when paired with the Wolf sidekick Dink. To put his inclusion into perspective, Doink would not even be part of WrestleMania that year. Interestingly, shortly after the game's release, Midway executive Roger Sharp claimed that Adam Bomb appears in the game too, which as we know does not seem to be the case. Many years later though, fellow developer Sal DeVita clarified what was meant here by confirming that Adam Bomb was a hidden character, but also stated that the character in the game was not fully completed. In regards to this game's lineup, another interesting factoid is that this was every single roster member in the game's arcade debut, bringing even further meaning to the name The New Generation. Now in terms of this game's gameplay, as you can see, this game is truly bonkers, even when we take into account that this title is based around the already cartoonish world of professional wrestling. The game is so different to anything that came before it, and it stands out in many ways, more than just digitized graphics, as you have probably noticed already throughout this video. Rather than having characters in this one attempting to emulate the action seen on TV, the game presents even more over-the-top shenanigans than what we saw in real life, if we can consider wrestling real life, if you know what I'm trying to say. Rather than a traditional wrestling game, the best way I can describe how this one functions is basically a Mortal Kombat game where players can walk into the background and foreground rather than being restricted to just one single plane. The combat between this game and Mortal Kombat certainly has its similarities. This includes the use of uppercuts that can send opponents flying into the air and dynamic over-the-top maneuvers in general. Thankfully there are some wrestling elements in this game though which are not included in Midway's gore fests, such as the ability to send opponents into the ropes to execute hip tosses, drop kicks along with other moves of that ilk. As mentioned earlier, it is all a very cartoony affair. Speaking of cartoon violence, perhaps the game's most memorable feature is the level of ludicrousy this game delves to. For example, Doink the Clown can pull a mallet out of thin air, Razor Ramon's arm can transform into a blade, or Bam Bigelow's fists can catch on fire. There is so much cool nonsense here. Like before this game, did you ever think you would be able to play a game where the Undertaker can perform Hadoukens? Well, with Wrestlemania the arcade game, it makes this craziness a reality. As mentioned, whilst wrestling moves are amongst all of this, it is all much more Mortal Kombat-like than anything else. What I also found amusing is that whenever you perform a wrestling move, you can literally hear your opponent's bones crunching, which is out of place for what the game is, but so satisfying and amusing at the same time. Like Mortal Kombat characters, Wrestlemania characters also have life bars, that through depleting your opponents, victory can be achieved. Again, like Mortal Kombat, the perfect win results in a flawless victory, which flashes up on the screen, and there are various comical, extremely tongue-in-cheek character animations throughout. The game features multiple play modes suitable for both 1 and 2 players of a cabinet. The game basically features a difficulty setting, giving players a choice to go on a campaign to win the Intercontinental Championship or the WWF Championship. These campaigns mix singles matches with 2-on-1 handicap matches and 3-on-1s, but exclusive to the WWF Championship mode is a gauntlet match known as the Wrestlemania Challenge, where players must eliminate every wrestler in the game in a 3-on-1 encounter with a new wrestler stepping into the ring every time an opponent is eliminated. In the game's 2-player modes, there is a simple 1-on-1 versus mode between 2 players, or the 2 players team up in a bunch of tag team matches players. Holla holla holla! The end of this mode once again features a Wrestlemania challenge where players must see off 4 different tag teams. Something we have not touched a great deal on yet is this game's fantastic sound. Yes, I have mentioned the satisfying bone crunching, but what I have failed to cover so far is that commentary is provided in the game by Vince McMahon and Jerry the King Lawler, and Howard Finkel welcomes players to WrestleMania at the start screen. On top of all of this, characters all have their own unique entrance themes that are loyal to WWF television, and the opening themes to Monday Night Raw, Superstars and Wrestling Challenge are all part of the soundtrack too. So whilst the gameplay itself is not faithful to wrestling, at least the music does a good job. As you can see from all of this, Wrestlemania the arcade game was vastly different to both the WrestleFest and Superstars, presenting players with something completely different to what the Japanese had brought to the table previously. In terms of this American game, GamePro gave the arcade version a very positive review, stating it had an unmatched level of detail in the digitised characters and featured a wacky sense of humour and very accessible controls. They summarised with lose the basketball from NBA Jam, take away the blood from Mortal Kombat, throw in some famous wrestlers, and you have WWF Wrestlemania, one of the most addictive arcade games to date. Next Generation echoed these sentiments, describing the game as a sort of bloodless Mortal Kombat that is similar but much better than WWF Raw. They applauded the cleanly digitised characters, variety of moves, ability to play either head-to-head or two-on-two cooperative, and sense of humour. Now, another feature that separated this game from the other WWF Arcade games that came before them is that this game actually received home ports, which, like all WWF console games before them, were published by Acclaim, the company who owned LJN. From what I can tell, the first of these ports arrived on the Sony PlayStation in October of 1995, with critics adoring the PlayStation version of the game. GamePro praised this title for having combos which are easy to stumble across, engaging commentary and other sound effects, and an extensive combination of realistic wrestling moves and comical magic moves which tap into the fantasy appeal of wrestling. They concluded this time that the PlayStation port was a great wrestling game, a great fighting game, and a great as fun to watch as it is to play game. Next Generation said on the PlayStation, the game looks great and plays even better, and EGM gave it a 9 out of 10 and the Editor's Choice Platinum Award. The following month would see the game ported to the Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive and Sega 32X, with the game varying in quality from hardware to hardware. GamePro would complain that the 32X version was no match for the PlayStation equivalent and lacks many of the sound samples of the arcade version, but at least has better graphics than the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo versions. They would at least acknowledge though that WrestleMania Arcade was still one of the very best games available in the entirety of the 32X's small hardware library. They would find that the main issues with the Mega Drive version was its excessive graininess and conspicuous slowdown, and that the gameplay is somewhat shallow. Once again though, they would note that WrestleMania Arcade was the best WWF game available on the Mega Drive machine. They would also report that the Super Nintendo version was the worst of the entire bunch, criticising it for its reduced character roster, slow game speed, smaller sprites and tinny sound effects. I guess Sega does what Nintendo don't. Rather strangely, the Sega Saturn version of the game would not arrive until May of 1996, which I'm going to infer may have been slow to appear on the system, as it may have been deprioritised as the Sega Saturn sold badly in comparison to most of the other systems the game had appeared on previously. GamePro would note that the Saturn port was an almost flawless conversion of the PlayStation version, with the only shortcomings being some graininess around the edges and slowdown in the cooperative mode. They would also comment though, considering how much later that this game arrived on Saturn hardware, that the game did not receive any upgrades, such as an increased character roster for example, to compensate Saturn owners for their long wait. Overall though, if you played the arcade version of this game or experienced it on the 32X Saturn or PlayStation, I think you're in for a good time. The game is just as fun in my opinion to laugh at for its lunacy as it is to play, and I reckon this is probably a game you can have fun with whether you are a fan of wrestling or not. It's just such a freaking unique affair, and one of the weirdest official spins on Mortal Kombat that we ever saw from Midway. This really is the Mortal Kombat of wrestling games. It's up for debate whether or not this game tops WrestleFest that came 4 years prior, but no one can possibly complain about this one failing to try and bring something different to the wrestling table. For these reasons, WrestleMania the arcade game will always stick out in my mind for its contributions to gaming. So with all of this said, this ladies and gentlemen was the mad story of WrestleMania the arcade game, the Mortal Kombat wrestling game. From here, I think the next logical step in this series would either be to give coverage to WWF In Your House or WWF Royal Rumble. I'd be curious to hear which of these two games you would like to see me cover next. The next digitised WWF game or the next WWF Arcade game? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you are new here and you have found my content due to being a wrestling fan, I have an abundance of content on this channel for you to check out, from wrestling game videos to beat 'em ups, fighting games and obscure console retrospectives. There is plenty to dig through on here, all delivered in a documentary fashion. So if you like what you found, be sure to hit those like, subscribe and notification bell buttons. Today's video was not chosen by myself, but in fact the wise folks who back this channel on Patreon, whose funding make these videos possible for you all to view. If you want to vote on future content, join my Discord, game production credits and more, then please consider backing this channel on the Patreon platform. We have a great community over there. It all really helps me do what I do. Huge thank yous and shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heyo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmek, Doug Perkins, BXL Gotham, Normal Guy, Ryan Dinched, Evan Balder, Philip Namp, Camber Rambo 82, Azrael Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, Sponge Matt B, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Bubba Kitty, Ron Studd, Hootie McBoob, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlamink Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marco Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yo, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Darn, Adam Castin, Gregory Smoragiewicz, Rick 67, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazansky. I can genuinely only do what I do because of you. Thank you so much. Yeah.